Ethan just spoke on a really tough question for us, so we thought we'd take it down a little bit and go easy on you. So now we have, why is the God of the Old Testament so violent? Now, this may be a question that you've heard a lot over the last few years, as this is a view that's actually been popularized by the famous atheist Richard Dawkins. Maybe some of you guys have heard of him or read his book. But this is what Richard Dawkins has to say about the God of the Old Testament. He says he's arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a capriciously malevolent bully, and he also calls him a genocidal tyrant, for whoever asked that question before. But it may be that some of you here today are also struggling with that same issue. Maybe you've come across passages in the Old Testament that disturb you, and they've maybe led you even to that same conclusion that actually to you, God seems a bit like a violent bully. For example, what about those places in the Old Testament where God not only explicitly orders his people to go to war against other nations, but he even commands them to leave nobody alive and to kill everything that breathes? This morning, I'm going to focus on those warfare texts in particular, because out of all the texts that we find in the Old Testament, I think these are actually the most challenging. But before we get into them, I want to give you one practical tip for making sense of the Old Testament that is useful no matter what text you're reading, and that's this: don't jump to conclusions, because sometimes first impressions can be really misleading. I discovered this for myself the first time that I went to stay with my in-laws who live in New Jersey. They're Italian Americans, and I was sitting out on the back deck when suddenly I heard raised voices from inside the house. And so I looked back into the kitchen through the glass, only to see my husband Vince and his mum in the middle of what looked like a massive screaming match. They were both bright red in the face, their noses were about 1 inch away from each other, and their arms were just gesticulating wildly. And what made the whole thing even more terrifying was that Vince's mum had been chopping garlic with this huge kitchen knife, and so now she just starts waving it around in her hands and then kind of pointing it in Vince's face when she's making a really important point. Thankfully, things finally calmed down and Vince walked away, and so I went to find him to ask if he was doing okay and what had happened with his mum. But Vince just looked at me blankly because he had no idea what I was talking about, and he reassured me that he and his mum had just been having a perfectly pleasant conversation. And so I said, but what about the raised voices and the hands and the knife waving? And he just laughed and said, Joe, that's just how Italian Americans talk to each other. And I completely misunderstood the situation. What looked to me like a knife fight was actually Italian Americans just loving each other. And it shocked me that even as someone who'd grown up watching American TV and who's used to traveling to different countries and who even speaks the same language, well, sort of, anyway, I could still so badly misinterpret another culture. My point is this: if I had that much trouble understanding Italian Americans in New Jersey in the 21st century, how much more challenging should I sometimes expect to find understanding and interpreting the ancient culture of the Old Testament from 3,000 years ago? When we step into the Old Testament, we're actually stepping into a very wildly different world, and a world that will initially shock us and at times is going to confuse us. But if, instead of immediately leaping to the worst possible conclusions, we take the time to try and understand the Old Testament from the perspective of its own culture and its own history, then rather than being shocked, you may, like me, actually be amazed by what you find. When it comes to this particular question of why the God of the Old Testament seems so violent, there are 3 questions we need to ask to dig a little deeper. The first is this: is there another side to the story? People sometimes seem to get a kick out of presenting the God of the Old Testament as this malevolent bully, while contrasting him with the hipster version of Jesus, this guy with just a sort of epic beard who was really into giving out free hugs. But actually, by setting them up against each other in this way, it seriously misrepresents both of them. Because throughout the entire Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, we consistently encounter the same God who is totally sold out for both justice and for love. And this commitment to love and justice is directly shown through God's choosing of the Israelites to be his people in the Old Testament, not because he has favorites, but that actually ultimately so that all peoples on the earth would be blessed through them. Rather than this being a God who hates outsiders, notice the exceptionally high standard of love that God commands the Israelites to treat foreigners with when he says that the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as you love yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. And in actual fact, God is so opposed to violence and so committed to the preserving of human life in the brutal, bloody culture of the ancient world, that even when circumstances at times require Israel to engage in warfare, in general, God's guidelines for warfare at that time are strikingly ethically advanced. So, for example, while the standard practice in ancient warfare was to rape captive women, the Israelites were prohibited from this. And while other tribes would frequently attack without warning, the Israelites were commanded by God to always offer their opponents the chance to surrender. And although in other nations men were forcefully conscripted into the military, in Israel, men were excused from fighting if they were recently married, if they just built a house, or even if they just didn't want to. These are just a few of many examples from the Old Testament which help to show us that actually there's far more to this issue and to the character of the God of the Bible than his critics are willing to admit. The second question that we need to ask ourselves is this: have the rumours about God's behaviour been exaggerated? It is true that there are a few unique instances in the Old Testament where God does go beyond his usual guidelines for warfare and where he does command the Israelites to kill everything that breathes, particularly in the Canaanite conquest. The text talks about devoting them to destruction. But even in these most extreme of circumstances, I want to suggest to you 4 ways in which the rumours of God's violence have been exaggerated. Firstly, that far from this being God's typical behaviour, these commands are actually only given in the rarest and most exceptional of circumstances in a specific time, a specific place, against a specific people and for a specific purpose. And what this means is that actually this kind of warfare was never intended as an example